Everyone pays a price for the life they end up living. That's not a threat. It's simply how the arithmetic works. The only real choice available to anyone is which price they pay, not whether a price gets paid at all. It's worth being precise about why this framing matters so much before we go any further. Most people implicitly believe there's a version of life available where no real price gets paid at all, a kind of default setting that costs nothing. That belief, however comforting, simply isn't accurate. The default setting, the one that feels like avoiding a price, is itself a choice with its own cost attached, one that simply happens to be collected later and in a less obvious form than the alternative. Most people never actually frame it this way. They imagine two separate paths, one that costs something and one that doesn't, and they instinctively reach for the one that looks free. But the supposedly free path was never actually free. It simply charges a different currency, collected later, quietly, in a form that doesn't announce itself the way an upfront cost does. Today, we're going to walk through what sacrifice actually is, why it functions less like a punishment and more like a trade, and why the specific price paid up front tends to be dramatically smaller than the price paid later by anyone who tried to avoid paying anything at all. This is a longer session because the word sacrifice tends to trigger an immediate negative reaction in most people, one that shuts down real thinking before it has a chance to start. We're going to slow down considerably and actually examine what the word means in practice, because the resistance most people feel toward it is based on a misunderstanding that, once cleared up, changes how the entire subject feels from the inside. Here's the first thing worth understanding. Sacrifice isn't a loss, it's a trade, and trades, by definition, involve giving something up in exchange for something else you value more. Nobody describes a fair trade as a sacrifice in ordinary life. If you hand someone $20 for a meal you actually want, you don't walk away feeling you sacrificed $20. You recognize you made an exchange, and you're satisfied with the terms. The exact same logic applies to trading an hour of comfortable scrolling for an hour of genuine skill building, except most people never frame it that way, and instead experience it as loss rather than exchange. This reframing matters more than it sounds like it should. Something experienced as pure loss tends to produce resentment and eventual abandonment. The same action, experienced as a deliberate trade for something genuinely valued, tends to produce sustained commitment instead. The behavior can be identical. The internal experience of it, and how long a person actually sticks with it, changes considerably depending on which frame is being used. There's a simple test worth applying to any sacrifice you're currently making or considering. Ask what you're actually trading it for, specifically, not vaguely. If the honest answer is something you genuinely value more than what's being given up, the trade is likely sustainable. If you can't actually name what you're trading it for, that's a meaningful signal, because an unnamed trade tends to feel like pure loss regardless of how objectively worthwhile it might be, and pure loss sustained long enough eventually gets abandoned. Here's the second thing worth understanding. There's an invisible ledger running behind every single day, whether or not anyone bothers to check it, and comfort has a specific, if quiet, interest rate attached to it. When you choose the comfortable option today, that choice rarely produces any visible immediate consequence. Nothing collapses. Nothing announces itself as a mistake. But a small entry gets recorded in the ledger anyway, and unlike a visible cost, this one accrues interest silently in the background, compounding across weeks and months, until eventually someone looks up and finds a balance considerably larger than any single decision along the way would have suggested. This is precisely why comfort feels so deceptively harmless in the moment. There's no receipt handed over for choosing the easier option today. The bill arrives much later, often disconnected enough from the original decision that the connection between the two is easy to miss entirely, which is exactly what makes this particular ledger so easy to ignore for years at a time. There's a useful practice for making this invisible ledger somewhat more visible before the balance grows too large. At the end of each week, ask honestly which comfortable choices you made simply out of habit. versus which uncomfortable choices you made deliberately in service of something you actually wanted. This isn't about judging yourself harshly for the comfortable choices. It's about simply seeing the ledger clearly enough to notice the balance before it's grown large enough to become genuinely difficult to address. Here's the third thing worth understanding. Small, repeated sacrifices carry more power than a single large one. And this surprises people because a single dramatic act of sacrifice tends to feel more meaningful in the moment than a boring, repeated small one ever does. This surprise is worth examining directly because it explains a lot of failed New Year's resolutions and abandoned ambitious plans. The dramatic version feels at the moment of committing to it like the more serious and impressive choice, and it often generates real enthusiasm and social approval in that initial moment. The small, boring version generates almost none of that initial excitement, which is precisely why it's so consistently underestimated, despite being the version that actually tends to survive long enough to produce a meaningful result. Think about the difference between someone who sacrifices an entire year in one dramatic, isolated burst of effort, and someone who sacrifices a small, consistent amount every single day across that same year. The dramatic burst is emotionally satisfying and makes for a good story, but it's genuinely difficult to sustain, and it often collapses under its own intensity before it has time to compound into much of anything. The small, repeated version rarely feels significant on any single day, and that's exactly why it survives long enough to actually accumulate into something considerable. This is worth internalizing directly, because it changes what actually deserves your attention day to day. The goal was never finding one enormous life-altering sacrifice to make once. It's identifying the small, sustainable one you can actually repeat, without heroics, for months and years at a stretch, since it's the repetition, not the size, that eventually produces the result. There's a specific reason the small, sustainable version tends to survive where the dramatic version fails. A dramatic sacrifice often depends on a temporary surge of motivation or emotion to sustain it, and that surge, being temporary by nature, eventually fades, taking the sacrifice down with it. A small, modest sacrifice doesn't require that same emotional fuel to sustain, precisely because it was never designed to run on intensity in the first place. It runs on habit instead, which is a considerably more reliable and durable engine over a long stretch of time. Here's the fourth thing worth understanding. The most valuable thing being sacrificed is rarely time or money. It's usually an old identity, one that has to be quietly set down before a new one has room to take shape. Consider what it actually means to become someone who wakes early, someone who follows through, someone who chooses discipline consistently. That transformation requires giving up being the version of yourself who didn't do those things. And that particular sacrifice is considerably harder than giving up an hour of sleep or $1 of spending, because it requires letting go of a self-concept that, however unhelpful, has at least been familiar. This explains why some people can intellectually understand exactly what needs to change and still fail to change it. The obstacle was never really information. It was the discomfort of no longer being able to think of themselves in the old familiar way, and that particular discomfort doesn't resolve simply by knowing what to do differently. It resolves by actually doing it differently, repeatedly, until the old identity has genuinely been replaced rather than merely criticized from the outside. This also explains a pattern worth watching for. In yourself, where a new habit gets sabotaged not by external circumstances, but by something that feels almost like internal resistance to the change itself. That resistance is often the old identity quietly defending its own continued existence, since being replaced, even by something objectively better, still involves a kind of loss. Naming that resistance directly, as the old identity's understandable but unhelpful attempt to persist, tends to make it considerably easier to move through rather than being derailed by it. Here's the fifth thing worth understanding. The middle of any meaningful sacrifice is almost always invisible, both to other people and, uncomfortably, often to yourself as well. This particular stretch deserves special attention because it's genuinely the hardest part to navigate correctly. Unlike the beginning, which is at least clearly identifiable, and the end, which announces itself through visible results, the middle offers almost no clear signal about whether things are actually working. This ambiguity is precisely what makes it the point where the largest number of genuinely well-intentioned efforts quietly get abandoned, not from lack of commitment, but from a reasonable seeming but ultimately incorrect conclusion that the lack of visible progress means the approach itself has failed. The beginning of a new discipline tends to feel exciting, full of fresh motivation and visible momentum. The end, once results have finally arrived, tends to feel rewarding and worth celebrating. But the middle, the long, unremarkable stretch where effort continues without any visible proof it's actually working yet, is where almost everyone who eventually quits actually quits. Not at the beginning, when motivation is high, and not near the end, when results are close. In the flat, invisible middle, where nothing seems to be happening at all. Understanding this in advance changes how that middle stretch actually feels while you're inside it. Instead of interpreting the lack of visible progress as evidence the whole effort is failing, you can recognize it correctly as simply what the middle of any genuine sacrifice looks like from the inside, indistinguishable in the moment from a genuinely failing effort, and separable only by continuing long enough for the difference to eventually show up. A useful practice for surviving this specific stretch: track inputs rather than only watching for outputs. You can't directly control when visible results arrive, but you can track honestly whether you actually kept the commitment on a given day, regardless of whether that day produced any visible sign of progress. That input-based tracking tends to provide a more reliable sense of whether things are actually on track than waiting for the output-based evidence, which, by definition, isn't reliably available yet during the exact stretch where it would be most reassuring to have. Here's the sixth thing worth understanding. Patience in this specific context isn't passive waiting. It's a skill built through repetition, exactly the same way any other skill gets built. This reframe matters because treating patience as a fixed trait creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. Someone who believes they simply weren't born patient tends to avoid the exact situations that would actually build the capacity, since avoiding discomfort feels easier than testing a belief you're not confident will turn out favorably. Someone who understands patience as trainable, by contrast, has a reason to lean in to those same uncomfortable situations deliberately, since each one becomes a rep in building a capacity they genuinely believe is buildable, rather than confirmation of a fixed limitation they believe they're simply stuck with. Most people treat patience as a fixed trait, something you either have or don't, similar to height or eye color. But patience behaves considerably more like a muscle than a fixed trait. It strengthens specifically through the repeated experience of tolerating delayed reward, and it weakens through the repeated experience of grabbing for whatever immediate reward happens to be available instead. Every time you choose the delayed reward over the immediate one, you're not simply making one isolated decision. You're training the underlying capacity to make that same choice more easily the next time. This means patience is available to build even for someone who currently feels they have very little of it. The path isn't waiting for patience to arrive as a personality trait. It's practicing small, deliberate acts of delayed gratification repeatedly in low-stakes situations until the capacity itself has genuinely strengthened enough to handle considerably higher stakes situations later. There's a practical starting point for this specific training, and it doesn't require anything related to your larger goals at all. Choose any small, low-stakes moment of immediate desire, an urge to check a notification, an urge to snack, an urge to interrupt someone mid-sentence, and practice simply letting a short delay pass before acting on it. This isn't about permanently denying the impulse. It's about practicing the specific muscle of tolerating a gap between wanting something and getting it in a context low stakes enough that the practice itself carries almost no real cost either way. And here's the seventh and final truth worth naming. The specific things being given up are rarely as important as the direction they're being given up in service of. An hour of sleep, sacrificed for no clear reason, produces nothing but tiredness. The exact same hour, sacrificed deliberately in service of a clearly understood goal, produces something entirely different. The sacrifice itself, examined in isolation, looks identical in both cases. What differs entirely is whether it's connected to a direction that actually justifies it. And that connection is what determines whether the sacrifice compounds into something meaningful or simply depletes you for no eventual return. This is why sacrifice without a clearly understood reason behind it tends to be unsustainable, regardless of how much willpower is initially available to sustain it. Willpower alone, disconnected from a genuinely understood reason, tends to run out considerably faster than willpower, anchored to a direction that's been thought through clearly and revisited regularly enough to stay vivid, a useful test for whether a given sacrifice is actually anchored to a clear direction. Try explaining, out loud, in 1 or 2 sentences, exactly why this specific trade matters to you. If the explanation comes easily and specifically, the anchor is likely solid. If the honest answer is something vague like because I should or because everyone says to, that vagueness is a meaningful signal that the sacrifice is currently running on borrowed motivation rather than a genuinely understood reason of your own, and borrowed motivation tends to run out considerably sooner than the genuinely owned kind. There's an 8th truth worth adding here, closely related to the ledger discussed earlier. Not all comfort is actually the enemy, and treating every single comfortable choice as something to eliminate tends to produce a considerably less sustainable pattern than distinguishing between comfort that restores you and comfort that simply distracts you. Genuine rest, chosen deliberately, is not part of the invisible ledger discussed earlier. It's a legitimate, necessary input that makes the sustained sacrifice actually possible over the long run. The problem was never comfort itself. It was comfort chosen by default unconsciously as the path of least resistance in moments that actually called for something else. A person who never permits themselves any genuine rest tends to burn out considerably faster than one who distinguishes clearly between restorative comfort, which supports the larger effort, and avoidant comfort, which quietly undermines it. The practical distinction worth applying here. Before choosing a comfortable option, ask honestly whether you're choosing it because you genuinely need the rest right now, or because it's simply the easiest available option in the moment. The first is a legitimate part of any sustainable pattern. The second is exactly the kind of entry that quietly accumulates on the invisible ledger discussed earlier. This distinction also explains why some people who appear highly disciplined from the outside don't actually burn out the way a purely willpower-driven approach would predict. They've simply learned to distinguish these 2 categories of comfort clearly enough that genuine rest gets taken without guilt, while avoidant distraction gets caught and redirected before it accumulates into a habit. The discipline isn't in avoiding comfort entirely, which is neither possible nor healthy. It's in sorting comfort accurately into the category it actually belongs to. And there's a 9th truth worth naming before we bring everything together. The specific price paid tends to shrink considerably once the trade has become habitual, which means the hardest period of any sacrifice is almost always near the beginning, not later on, as most people initially assume. This is genuinely good news, even though it doesn't feel that way at the start. The discomfort of a new sacrifice is at its absolute highest in the earliest days and weeks, precisely because nothing about it is automatic yet, and every single instance requires conscious, effortful choice. As the pattern repeats, the same action gradually requires less and less conscious effort to sustain, until, eventually, it requires barely any deliberate willpower at all, having quietly become simply how things are done rather than a battle fought fresh each day. Knowing this in advance changes how the earliest, hardest stretch actually feels. Instead of assuming the difficulty experienced in week 1 is a permanent feature of the sacrifice itself, you can correctly recognize it as the temporary cost of building something that will, with genuine consistency, become considerably easier to sustain than it currently feels. There's a useful way to hold on to this during the actual difficult early days, when the promise of it getting easier can feel abstract and unconvincing. Keep a specific, brief record of how difficult each day's instance of the sacrifice actually felt, on some simple scale, even just a rough sense of harder or easier than the day before. Looking back at that record after a few weeks tends to reveal a gradual downward trend in difficulty that's genuinely hard to perceive day to day, but becomes considerably more obvious in aggregate, providing exactly the kind of concrete evidence that makes it easier to trust the process continues to work even during a temporarily difficult stretch. So let's bring these 9 truths together, because on their own they're interesting observations, but together they form something considerably more useful. Sacrifice is a trade, not a pure loss, and framing it that way changes how sustainable it actually is. There's an invisible ledger running underneath comfort, quietly compounding whether or not anyone bothers to check it. Small, repeated sacrifices outperform single dramatic ones. Because repetition, not intensity, is what actually compounds. The identity being given up often matters more than the time or money involved. The invisible middle is where almost everyone who quits actually quits, and recognizing that in advance helps you stay in it longer. Patience is a trainable skill, not a fixed trait you either have or don't. The direction behind a sacrifice matters more than the specific thing being sacrificed. Not all comfort is the enemy. Distinguish restorative rest from avoidant distraction. And the hardest stretch is almost always the beginning, which gets easier with repetition, not harder. None of these 9 truths require you to become a different kind of person overnight, or to suddenly develop an unusual capacity for suffering that most people don't have. What they require is considerably more modest, identifying one small sustainable trade you're willing to make consistently, connected to a direction you actually understand, and repeating it long enough for the invisible ledger to eventually tip in your favor. Here's a practical way to start applying this without needing some dramatic, all-or-nothing overhaul right away. Identify one specific comfort you currently default to without much thought. Something small enough that giving it up wouldn't require heroic willpower, but real enough that giving it up consistently would genuinely matter over time. Before changing anything, get specific about the direction this particular trade is actually in service of, not a vague general sense of wanting to improve. A specific, articulated reason you could explain clearly to someone else. This step matters more than it initially seems to, because a sacrifice disconnected from a clearly understood direction tends to run out of steam considerably faster than one anchored to something specific and genuinely meaningful to you. It's worth writing this reason down somewhere you'll actually see it again, not simply thinking it once and moving on. Motivation, even genuinely felt in the moment of deciding, tends to fade with distance and time, and a written reminder, revisited during the inevitable difficult stretches, does considerably more work than relying on memory alone to keep the original reason vivid enough to sustain the trade through its hardest moments. Then commit to the small trade for a defined, honest stretch of time. 30 days is a reasonable starting point, and treat the invisible middle stretch, whenever it arrives, as expected and normal, rather than as evidence that the whole effort isn't working. At the end of that period, do an honest accounting, not of whether the results have fully arrived yet, since 30 days is rarely long enough for that, but of whether the trade itself felt sustainable enough to continue past the initial deadline. If the honest answer at the end of 30 days is that the trade felt genuinely unsustainable, that's useful information too, not a personal failure. It may simply mean the specific trade chosen was too large for a first attempt, or that the direction behind it wasn't actually as clear or compelling as initially assumed. Adjusting the size or the reasoning and trying again is a considerably more productive response than concluding. From one difficult attempt, that sacrifice in general simply isn't something you're capable of sustaining. One last thing worth sitting with before we close. Years from now, if you've actually sustained a pattern like this, The specific things you gave up along the way will likely have stopped feeling like sacrifices at all. They'll simply feel like who you are, the ordinary, unremarkable shape of your actual daily life, no longer requiring the same conscious effort they once did. There's a reason this endpoint is worth naming clearly in advance, because it changes how the entire journey toward it actually feels. Without knowing that the effort genuinely does decrease over time, every stretch of the process can feel like it should be exactly as difficult as the beginning was, indefinitely, which is both inaccurate and considerably more discouraging than the actual trajectory most sustained sacrifices follow. Knowing the effort curve bends downward, even while the specific behavior stays exactly the same, makes it considerably easier to trust the process through the parts where it still feels hard. That's genuinely the endpoint worth aiming for, not a permanent state of gritted teeth willpower, but a point where the trade has been repeated so consistently that it's quietly become identity rather than effort. Getting there doesn't require one dramatic act of sacrifice. It requires the small, sustainable trade, repeated past the invisible middle, for considerably longer than feels rewarding at almost any single point along the way. If you only take one thing from the last 30 minutes, let it be this. The price was always going to get paid, one way or another, whether you chose it deliberately or simply let it accumulate by default in the invisible ledger of comfort. The only genuine choice available to you was ever which price, paid on which terms, at which point in your life. Choosing the smaller, deliberate price today, connected to a direction you actually understand, is simply the more favorable version of a trade that was, in some form, always going to be made regardless. That trade is available to you again tomorrow, exactly as available as it was today, asking the same quiet question it's always asked. Not eventually. Tomorrow, in whatever small, unglamorous form it happens to take. That's genuinely where the price, and the life it eventually buys, actually gets paid.